Okay, let's quickly explore the URP template now. So right away in game, we see a striking difference in comparison to the basic 3D template. We have more sophisticated lighting, and we also have post-processing effects. So let's do a quick tour of our scene. By the way, I'm on the default Unity editor layout, which you can select by going to Window, Layouts, and Default. Select your preference in terms of the layout of your editor, but for now I'll go with the default. Okay, so let's look at our objects in the scene. We have our typical main camera with different values than we're used to seeing by default for its position and rotation. And we also have this simple camera controller and universal additional camera data. So we won't really play around with the universal additional camera data. I won't go into detail on what it actually does, but the simple camera controller is actually something that's really cool. So if I start the game and I use WASD, we already have a script to allow us to move the camera. I can also hold left click and move around my observer. So that's pretty cool. I can also hold left shift to increase the speed of the displacement of the camera. So that's pretty cool for testing purposes. What else do we have? We have the typical directional light, and we have two new game objects in the scene, post-process volume and example assets. So example assets are all of these game objects that you see in the scene here. So we have one game object that basically is the parent to all of these other objects. We'll talk about the game object parent-child relationship soon when I'll just do a review of hierarchical transforms. But for now, let's go back to this post-process volume. So what is post-processing? Well, this is something that's added to the scriptable rendering pipeline. And we have an example of its usage here. So the scriptable rendering pipeline allows us to inject our own post-processing code. And this template comes with this script volume that does some post-processing effects. So what is post-processing? It's basically, if I turn this off, we'll see. Okay, this is our original rendered image. Once we get this image, all these pixels, we can run a few processes to just modify the image. It's basically like your Snapchat or Instagram filters. So what do we have? Let me click on this to activate the post-processing. We have tone mapping, bloom, and vignette. All of these can be modified with different parameters in the inspector. So let's go one by one. Let's go with tone mapping. Well, tone mapping is pretty simple. It basically adjusts the contrast in our picture to really, as you can see here, sharpen up the colors, add more contrast. It's more dynamic. If we just compare both of them, the shadows seem a bit faded. All the colors seem a bit muted. Tone mapping does some color correction, which I personally like. Bloom is a bit more controversial, not as much as motion blur. So bloom here is light bleeding. It's a pretty good technique to hide imperfect edges or really jagged edges if you don't have anti-aliasing. So the Nintendo Switch uses this, the Nintendo Wii uses this a bunch. Like if you look at gameplay from Mario Galaxy, to hide the low polygon count and the low resolution, they just bloomed everything so that bleeding light effect on the edges of models hid or masked some of the imperfections. And we can actually change the intensity of this bloom. So really look at this part of the screen. Look at how the light kind of bleeds or emanates from the edges of these thin wooden beams. So intensity 10 will give us this. Now this is a very fantastical effect, not really realistic. If we go to 100, then we get something much more intense, like we're getting blinded by this night neon city in a cyberpunk kind of game. Let's just stick with 1. If we don't have it, this is what we get. So this is the original image, and this is adding bloom post-processing onto the image. And finally, we have vignette. So I'll just shut down these effects. And what is vignette? It's a bit more subtle. Look at the edges of the picture here. So we're getting this kind of very light, dark burst on the edges. And it kind of mimics how we perceive light. So at the edges of our vision, in our peripheral vision, things appear a bit darker than what we're focusing on. So this kind of simulates that. So I'll just keep it on for default effects because I quite enjoy them. But if you don't like them, feel free to turn them off, no problem. Let's look a bit more in game. So if I go up here, you can see some difference. Let's look at the shadows here. They're pretty cool. And I think you get the idea. Okay. So that was cool for an example. We also have this README file that gives us more information. And as you can notice, our projects folder is a bit more complete than in the basic 3D template. So we have example assets, materials, presets, scenes, scripts, settings, tutorial info, and whatnot. So let's just clean up this project a bit so we have a good starting point. Whenever we'll create URP projects, this is something we'll have to do. So I'm just going to delete these example assets by deleting their parent game object. So in this scene, we have something but a lot more empty now. And this README file is not useful. I'll delete that. Example assets. Well, here we have the prefabs, the shaders, the textures, the materials for everything we just deleted in the scene. So we can go ahead and delete that. We have a material folder that contains our skybox. So might as well keep that for our future materials. Here we have presets. These are audio presets. So I'm not so sure we'll actually be touching anything audio related this semester. So we can just go along and delete that. Like this. Scenes, this is typical. We'll keep it. We have our sample scene in it, which is the scene that's currently open. Scripts, here we have the simple camera controller that I talked about earlier. That's on the main camera, simple camera controller. We can go ahead and keep that. Then we have settings. So these are settings for the rendering pipeline, if I'm not mistaken. So we have like lighting, shadows, post-processing, and other stuff. We won't be touching any of that. Again, if you're not comfortable with using the URP, you can do the entire semester on the 3D template, no problem. Here we have settings that I just talked about. Oops. And okay, here tutorial info. So this is just information that was found in that README file and resources related to that README file. So we can just go ahead and delete that. All right, so we have a pretty cool empty project now that's based on URP that allows for post-processing. Let's just go ahead and create a plane. So right click in the hierarchy, 3D object plane. Okay, so we can see it here. I'm just going to reposition my camera to 0, 0, 0, and I'm going to put the rotation to 0, 0, 0 as well. So let's look in this direction, and in game we won't see our plane. The plane is at 0, 0, 0 as well as the camera, so it's kind of clipping through it. Let's just pull the camera a bit back and we can bring it up a bit. And now we can see this plane. So I want to add a cube now. So 3D object cube. I'm going to bring it at 0.5 on Y and 0 for the Z axis. So it should be lying on the plane. And let's take a look at that. So personally, I think this cube on a plane looks much better than the typical cube on a plane from the 3D basic template. So that's basically the URP in a nutshell. We don't really have to do anything different in terms of how we manage our game objects, how we manage our resources. We just get this cool default lighting system, and we also also get to play with post-processing effects in a very simple manner.